My subject this afternoon is the need to take a quantum jump, to think again, to think radically about some familiar terms, some familiar political terms that are of fundamental importance in the analysis of contemporary trends in politics. I want to reflect again on such concepts as territory, territorio, place, lugar, power, potencia, poder, and the future of democracy, democracia. The spirit of what I want to say to you this afternoon is captured in one of the favorite jokes of Niels Bohr, the Danish quantum physicist who won the Nobel Prize in 1922. Niels Bohr liked to tell the story of the young rabbinical student who heard that a very famous rabbi was delivering a series of 3 lectures. He went to the first lecture and came away thoroughly excited. "Oh," he said, "that was clearly the best lecture I ever attended in my life. The rabbi was so clear, so persuasive, I understood everything." The young rabbinical student went to the second lecture, came away even more ecstatic. He said, "I understood this lecture more or less. It was a remarkable lecture by the rabbi. I learned so much. The rabbi was so clear. Quite clear anyway." Came away and then went to the third and final lecture, at which the young rabbinical student said, "Oh, it was easily the best lecture I ever attended in my life. Why, I understood nothing, and I think the rabbi didn't understand what he was saying." This famous joke sets the tone for the remarks that I want to make to you, because I want to challenge habitual ways of thinking about territory, place, space, power, democracy, politics. I want to suggest to you that it's possible to reconceptualize democracy, to think of it in a kaleidoscopic, I would say quantum way, in which democracy is understood as a process that involves multiple interacting spatial frameworks in which peoples, with the help of their representatives, seek to control power, to prevent arbitrary power, to do so within a multiplicity of spaces that have different space-time rhythms. What I have to say to you is an exercise in blue skies thinking. It suggests some reasons why the matter of territory and the territorial mentality of contemporary democracy is a problem, why much can be learned from the quantum tradition, particularly to do with extra dimensions within contemporary democratic politics. I want to follow in the footsteps of Hobbes, of, for example, Marx, of Pasteur, each of whom drew upon metaphors, concepts from the physical sciences, imported them into the analysis of the social and political world. And I want to suggest to you that key terms such as quantum weirdness, dark matter, space-time, multiverses, entanglement, indeterminacy, non-linearity, quantum tunneling, that all of these terms have a rich potential for the analysis of the problems that I'm going to lay out to you in the next few minutes. I want to suggest to you that prevailing approaches in the study of politics are wanting, that they suffer deficiencies. And I want to point out to you that there are experiments that are going on in the actually existing world, experiments in self-government that defy the old orthodoxies and can only be understood through the terms that I'm going to introduce to you this afternoon. I want, above all, to challenge what could be called the scholarly flatlands. I want to make a case for developing a more poetic, a more practical politics of democratic space. For this purpose, I have 6 points that I want to lay out. Each of these can be considered a conjecture. That is, a proposition for you to think about interconnected propositions that together point to the need for the quantum leap in political thinking about matters of power and the problem of arbitrary power in the 21st century. Let me begin with the first. It's the most obvious. Every existing democratic polity, Spain, France, Canada, South Africa, Australia, Chile, every one of these democratic polities is caught up in post-sovereign trends. That is, caught up in a salmagundi, a complex set of cross-border processes that are greatly reshaping the way democratic politics happens. Within the world of actually existing democracy, one could say, there is no longer anything like splendid isolation from the rest of the world. Boundary disputes, spillover effects, arbitrage pressures, butterfly effects are becoming normal. Things that happen politically in one place have effects elsewhere in faraway locations. The reverse dynamic is also common. Events, information flows, and so on that happen in far off places do touch off immediate local consequences. This is clear when we look at some of the pressures that existing democratic polities are under. Democratic polities, so-called nation-state democracies, are confronted with growing numbers of problems that cannot be dealt with by the territorial state alone. It's also the case that democracies and their dynamics are having influences, effects on other democracies. The symbol here, perhaps, is what might be called the Republic of Expatriates. There are something like 230 million people globally who are now living outside their countries, and this counts as the fifth largest polity in the world. This is a symbol of the fact that cross-border processes are increasingly shaping the dynamics, the domestic dynamics of existing democracies. There are less positive things that are happening. For example, democracies, the United States, Germany, decide things at home that have negative effects on peoples abroad. Or we find that there are growing numbers of cross-border chains of power that can have damaging effects on democracies. Think of fields such as immigration, or banking, or exchange rates, or tourism, or education, or policing, and military policies. All of these are having shaping effects at a distance. And there are some of these effects that can actually bring about near collapse of democracies. Think of bad banks, think of rotten air, think of violence, or think of nuclear spills. In each case, what happens in one democracy or elsewhere can damage life within democracy at home. There are even cases, I'm thinking of Kiribati and Tuvalu, Pacific democracies, whose territories are actually disappearing underwater because of rising sea levels. And there are the first legal disputes that have begun about who controls those territorial waters when the peoples of those democracies move to other territories. This is the first point, that there are increasing pressures on actually existing democracies from cross-border processes. Second conjecture is that these anomalies, so-called, increasingly challenge the orthodox model of understanding democracy. Actually existing democracy in the textbooks, in practice, are gripped by a territorial mentality, so that these processes that I've been describing are treated as anomalies, as unimportant misfits, as random exceptions. There are some scholars who insist that territorial place, lugar, is not only central to democracy as we understand it, but it is of rising importance. Here, the orthodox model is clear. Democracy requires a fixed, sovereign, territorial framework. Elections, parliaments, governments operate within a well-defined territorial space. And this is usually said to be consolidated by a common political culture, where elections are central, where there is a sense of national identity, that people feel as though they are part of this common polity. And there is usually a market economy that's said to be a basic functional prerequisite of democracy in this sense. Now, of course, this idea of this image of democracy and territory, this idea that the territorial nation state, the Estado Nacional, is the fixed and a vital framework for democracy, has a history. It has a history that goes back well into the 18th century, when democracy came to be redefined much more explicitly in territorial terms. We know that representative democracy greatly expanded the geographic scale of political life. The ancient Greek democracies were small. Mantinea, Argos were just a few square kilometers. The United States became a democratic republic on a vast continental scale. And so this has led many scholars to say that there is a qualitative difference between ancient and modern representative democracies. Bob Dahl, for example, insisted in his work that this was a qualitative change that almost makes one think twice about using the word democracy to describe both polities. What I think is striking is the way in which the discontinuity that has been pointed out by scholars is actually overemphasized, because it's true that there were new things that developed under modern territorial democratic conditions. There were new mechanisms, periodic elections, multi-party systems, written constitutions, parliaments. And it's true that territory came to be much more prominent in the mentality of democracies. Think for a moment about the origins of the word territory. At least in English, it comes from the Latin terra, meaning land, earth, nourishment, sustenance. Territory and the state are the guardian of the territorium. The territorium, from Latin, is a place from which people are warned. Notice the strange connotation. Territory is a place where others do not belong. And territory also has connotations of terra, terrera, meaning that territorial states protect populations from outsiders, and they have the ability, as states, to inflict fear, terror, on those who do not belong. These differences are clear, but what is striking from the perspective that I want to elaborate this afternoon is the deep hidden continuity between ancient and modern representative democracies. Classical Greek democracies, there were up to 100 of them, had a strong sense of chora, as the Greeks said, a sense of place. Ground served as the framework, the fixed framework of democratic encounters, of deliberations, of decisions by citizens. That is to say, both ancient and modern representative democracies understood that democracy was always infused with a location. That is, self-government of citizens took place through the medium of meaningful belonging in a defined place. One could say that democracy required demarcated physical places. Think of Spain. Democracy takes place within the Estado Nación. It takes place within the Comunidad Autónoma. It takes place within the provincias, and it takes place within the municipios. This is true for other democratic polities. So, for instance, even in bicameral systems, upper chambers of parliaments extend representation to place. That's true for the American Senate. It's true for the Australian Senate. The point here is that the topos, the anchor of meaningful belonging as a citizen in a democracy, or so it has been presumed, is measurable distance, latitude, longitude, elevation. Place, lugar, is a three-dimensional patch of the earth or the sea that is not equivalent to any other. We could say, to summarize this second point, that place is the address of democracy. It's the address where democracy lives. Third conjecture. We are living in times in which the cross-border pressures that I mentioned in the opening conjecture are encouraging thinkers of democracy to revise this territorial mentality of existing democracies. There are, in other words, efforts to redefine democracy so that it can take place or that it can come to terms somehow with these cross-border flows. The reactions are striking. Some of them are fatalistic. For example, there are some scholars and certainly citizens who think that democracy is a shrinking violet. That yes, it's true that there are all of these cross-border long-distance pressures on territorial democracies, but not much can be done about this. That is to say, democracy is withering away because there is no alternative but to think of democracy in territorial state terms. Another reaction, evident, for example, throughout the whole European Union today, is the demand to rebuild territorial democracy. According to this view, what has to happen is the democracies need to claw back cross-border powers so that the territorial state is again made central in the operation of territory. And usually this is done in the name of the people. Populism is an expression, I think, of this demand. There are those who think that these cross-border pressures can be only dealt with by recapturing the local. Think of Derrida's appeal for open cities and refuge cities. Think of those who call for deep democracy, Benjamin Barber. Their view is that self-government requires decentralized decision-making, citizens' self-determination through innovative grassroots forms of so-called deep democracy. Then there are those scholars, in the face of these cross-border pressures, who think of an image, a vision of global federalism. Cosmopolitanism, it is sometimes called. According to this idea, democracy could be redefined as what takes place at the territorial state level, but it could be extended to a global federal level, so that there could be, democracy could be thought of in terms of two levels of territory, one global and the other territorial state. And finally, there is an approach applied, for example, in the European Union in the last decade or so, which has been called demoicracy. Demoicracy. Here the idea of Calypso Nicolaidis, of Philippe Van Parijs and others, is that democracy could be conceived as multiple demoi. Think of territorial states conjoining in a kind of confederation where the sources of sovereign power are demoi, not just one, but several or more multiples of people. I want to say to you, and here I come to my fourth conjecture, that what binds together these various abreactions to the cross-border pressures on territorial state democracies is a continuing commitment to a territorial mentality. That is, these are in-house disagreements, or if you like, these are efforts to patch up a crumbling edifice of territorial state democracy. That is to say, what is problematic, and here is my fourth conjecture, is that the mentality of territorial democracy is unchallenged. And this territorial mentality is insufficiently complex to what might be called the quantum weirdness of these various trends. That is to say, there are things that are happening in the real world that are not merely stranger than were once thought. They are far stranger than we can presently think through democratic theory. That is to say, territorial understandings of democracy remain trapped on scholarly flatlands. They have a common sense understanding of territory as latitude, as longitude and altitude. But the problem is, what is needed is to think about multiverses, that is to say, multiple, differently sized democratic units, some of which extend across vast distances, through fields that stretch in all directions, from the local to the global to beyond even the global. If I could speak metaphorically for a moment in quantum language, I would say that theories of territorial democracy ignore phenomena ranging from quarks and neutrinos and gluons and photons and other elementary particles all the way through to the planets and the stars and the high-energy quanta energy zones, red dwarfs, Earth-sized exoplanets within the rapidly expanding and actually disappearing galaxy as we know it. That is to say, the whole territorial understanding of democracy ignores many phenomena because it can only think in three dimensions. What is needed is forms of thinking outside this three-dimensional approach that actually come to terms with, if you like, dark energy zones where the universe of democracy is actually being nudged and pushed in new directions for which we have no good conceptual language. Here I come in this conjecture to a basic methodological point. There are many things that are happening that are defined by quantum weirdness. If you think you understand democracy in the face of these trends, then you do not. What is needed, in other words, is a recognition of what we don't know, of the need to think differently because we cannot currently think with the language that we have. And in a strange way, as the quantum physicists have argued for some time, it is these very unknowns that harbor solutions. That is, puzzlement can be the midwife of new questions, of new ways of thinking, and new solutions to odd anomalies and unsolved problems. This brings me to the fifth conjecture. What we see happening in the world of actually existing democracy is a whole set of new experiments with self-government that squarely belong to the era of monitory democracy in the 21st century. That is to say, experiments in the arts of handling power that defy the territorial mentality of democracy. I want to mention just a few examples quickly to illustrate the point that I'm making about the need for a quantum turn in the way we think about democracy. Let me mention what I call biodemocracies. If you look at experiments in self-government such as the Haida Gwaii Islands of the People in the Northeast Pacific archipelago off the Canadian coast, or if you look at Uluru Kata National Park in central Australia, you will find indigenous peoples are handling power, deciding who gets what, when, and how, using different mechanisms that are not bound to territory in the conventional sense. Indeed, these experiments in self-government have quite different qualities. They are deeply aware of the dynamic, fragile complexity of the world. They are deeply aware of what the quantum physicists call the principle of non-linearity. Things that happen locally can have far-distance effects, and vice versa. These experiments in self-government extend the right of representation to the non-human. The presumption is that the non-human, the world of the biosphere, have rights of representation in human affairs. There is a strong awareness that arbitrary power is a bad thing. There is a strong sense that the whole universe in which this experiment of self-government takes place is dynamic, and that it basically defies the distinction between the human and the non-human, the local and the far away. A second type of trend in the 21st century is the development of new methods of linking together far-flung geographical places across many different time zones. The example of the Forest Stewardship Council, a major global regulatory body in the field of the world's forests, is a case in point. It is an experiment in self-government that has a parliament of 3 chambers. There are rights of representation for southern and northern hemisphere participants, and there is a sense that the human actors are themselves connected with the biosphere. Or let me take the case of the Central Tibetan administration. Here is a polity that has no fixed territorial place. Its homeland is an imaginary future homeland in Tibet. Its headquarters, if that is the right word, is in northern India, in Dharamsala. It is a polity that has a parliament. It has global constituencies. There are representatives from North America and Europe. It is a polity which is based upon religious tolerance. It is a polity based on a written constitution. It is a polity in which citizens value democracy, not only because it can rotate office holders, not only because it can guarantee certain freedoms, and not only because it guarantees the principle of equality, but because, strangely, for many theorists and outside observers, democracy is the guardian of impermanence. That is, it is a warning to human beings that they should not become attached to power, to things of this world. A reminder to citizens that they are only in this world temporarily, that they will move, so to say, to a future world in which nothing is essentially fixed. And finally, let me give the example of mobile elections. It is usually thought that elections are the centerpiece of democracy, that they take place in territorial state settings. That continues to be true, and the outcomes are important. But what is also striking is the way in which elections are having spillover effects. That is to say, in which elections are no longer housed exclusively in territorial state institutional frameworks. I'm thinking here of the way in which certain global bodies, such as the International Olympic Committee, conduct elections with secret ballot and rotation of leaders, term limits, and so on. I'm thinking also of the way in which some elections, the American presidential elections, for example, are becoming global phenomenon. Many millions of people witness the outcome of these elections because they know that the outcome will have global effects. That is to say, peoples of the world become deeply enfolded, implicate, as the quantum experts say, in the affairs of other polities. And there are elections where there is a kind of quantum tunneling that is happening. By that I mean that the dynamics spill across borders in national elections. A case in point is the fiercely fought 2013 election in Malaysia, the first time that diasporas were entitled to vote, in which quantum tunneling happened systematically. Citizens, candidates, campaigners, the election commission staff, flash mobs, election monitors, scrambled in all directions, traveling and messaging across borders, behaved in non-local ways in far-flung contexts from Singapore and southern Thailand to Kalimantan in Indonesia. Finally, sixth conjecture, I want to draw what I have said together to try to summarize the thrust of this approach, this fresh thinking, this appeal to make a quantum jump in matters of the analysis of power and politics and democracy. I've suggested to you that much can be learned from the concepts and the metaphors that are drawn from particle physics and cosmology, that it is possible to engage in unashamed blue skies thinking of the democratic imaginary, rethinking that imaginary so that it better makes sense of the developments of the 21st century. There is a sense of urgency in this project, or so I want to put to you. That is to say, there is a basic problem with the territorial bias in the imaginary of democracy, that there is a need to rethink the spirit, the language, the institutions of democracy in territorial state form, because increasingly democracy in this form is being unsettled, swamped, and undermined by a variety of cross-border causes and causers. My suggestion is that democracies are caught up in a whole thickening web of treaties, of regional organizations, of minilateral arrangements, of cross-border codes of conduct, partnerships with non-governmental actors, informal arrangements, and piecemeal policy experiments. What I've tried to do in this approach, in this quantum perspective on democracy, is to suggest to you that unless territorial democracies address these trends, then the prospects for democracy look grim and dim. I suggest that the confinement of democracy to state barracks is having disabling effects on the democratic imagination. And I have suggested how it can be remedied positively. The quantum approach that I am suggesting to you is that in the first decades of the 21st century, it is possible to redefine democracy, to set it loose on the world, to think of it as a political project, as an unfinished project, a never to be finished project, backed up by a way of life in which flesh and blood people together seek public controls over the exercise of power in a multiverse of interconnected spaces that defy the simple-minded understanding of territory as the address of democracy. I happen to think that this redefinition of democracy, of bringing a quantum perspective to the understanding of democracy, has policy relevance. If I am right, then democracy can be thought of as an ongoing, never-finished process of contestation of arbitrary power, of attempts in a multiplicity of spaces with a strong sense of non-linearity, an attempt to bring arbitrary power under public control. This understanding of democracy would include, for the first time, the biomes in which people live. That is to say, arbitrary power exercised by humans over biomes becomes problematic, undemocratic from this point of view. And here I join Elinor Ostrom and others who have pointed out the advantages of a polycentric understanding of democracy. If democracy is a rich mixture of experimental efforts at multiple levels and sites, all understood dynamically through the flow of free information and intense public monitoring of power, then it has certain problem-solving advantages over more centralized political methods of the territorial state form. I want to close by mentioning a very famous novel that appeared at the end of the 19th century, written by Edwin Abbott. Edwin Abbott was an English schoolmaster who wrote and published, to some sensation, a novel, a satirical novel called Flatland. It was published in 1884. I mentioned this book because repeatedly in these remarks I have appealed for you to leave the scholarly flatlands and to think in terms of 4 and possibly more dimensions, to break with a 3-dimensional understanding of democracy. In this novel, Flatland, there is a narrator called A Square. A Square tells us that in Flatland, people understand that there are only 2 dimensions to life. Men are polygons, women are straight lines. And these straight lines are particularly problematic for a two-dimensional polity because, for example, when women are moving about, they have to engage in what Abbott calls a peace cry. There have been recorded cases of fatal stabbings where women, as straight lines, cut through men who are polygons. One night, A Square has a dream. He dreams of a three-dimensional spaceland. That is, a world where three dimensions are commonly understood. He tries to popularize his dream. He tries to urge others to imagine a world beyond 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and possibly more. A Square ends his saga unhappily. A Square is imprisoned, and he is imprisoned permanently by the monarch, who will have nothing of this talk of 3 dimensions. Señoras y señoras, I want to thank you for your attention. I want to encourage you to reflect upon these conjectures. Above all, I want you to consider the proposition that democracy is trapped in a linguistic and conceptual flatland, and that there is time now and there is great necessity to go beyond it, to think of democracy in multiple space-time dimensions, much more dynamically, inclusive of biomes, so that democracy comes to be better equipped for handling the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you.